Felice, thank you so much for joining me here on the Homeschool Sanity Show. It's honestly quite a bit overdue for as long as we have known each other and been on the same podcasting network. But I'm going to have you begin by telling us more about you and your family currently.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we are sort of empty nesters. Sadly, your kids that you love and enjoy grow up and move out. So Jeff and I are currently in that, have a couple of adult kids that still live here. So it's wonderful, but we have a big house and they're at different ends and we sometimes see them. So I love it. I love having people around. But I started a publishing business by accident years ago. So I was asked to speak at a homeschool conference because I had a degree in education, and you must know how to teach science. Well, I hated science as a kid, as an educator, and as a homeschool mom. But sure, I can teach about science because I can teach you how to teach. And from that morphed Media Angels. And then from that morphed the Ultimate Homeschool Podcast Network and the Ultimate Christian Podcast Network. So I'm, as my nephew once said, Aunt Felice, you're on Amazon. And I go, yeah, that's really exciting. Like, he's known me, and I was not cool till he saw my books on there. But it's like, you never really know where God's going to take you. It's just saying that yes. Happily married to Jeffrey, who is, I don't want to call him my rock because that kind of, or he says, I'm the string on the end of your kite. And I like that better because at least he lets me fly a little. Every once in a while, he's like, okay. But he and I could not be more opposite. I mean, he's blonde with blue eyes, and I'm dark haired. I'd rather be snuggled up with a book, having it rain outside, and he's like, let's go outside and let's go on a hike, and that kind of thing. But it's worked for 45 years, and we are still in love with each other, probably more in love. We crack each other up. He said, as we get older, it's like it takes two of us to be one person because what the other one doesn't remember, the other person does. But he's great. And between the two of us, we have three businesses. And so we're still at it, Melanie. We talk about retiring at some point, but when it stops being super fun, then we might. But like I'll have meetings with my assistant, and I said, okay, I'm going to cut back. And then by the end, she said, you just gave me three more ideas. So I said, okay, well, I guess we're not ready. But I have three boys and two girls. The girls are married. The boys are not. And I have 9 grandchildren with one daughter. Yeah, that's Christina, who wrote the Truth Seekers mystery series with me, and she now is homeschooling her children. And my kids all say they plan on homeschooling someday. So at least, we always say as homeschoolers, oh no, am I ruining them? But praise God, we didn't. And 3 went to college, all graduated, super honors. 2 kids, the youngest 2 played sports in college. I homeschooled all the way through except for Mike and Anne. They decided to take one Spanish class at the community college, and the next thing I know, they're dually enrolled while in high school, and they were taking three courses, and I still managed to educate them in their high school years. But they had, I think with homeschoolers, if they're really interested and you can get them interested in things, they'll finish sooner than, the state says they should, or your credits say they should. So it gives you some leverage to do some fun things. And so that was a good exposure for them and kind of prepared them a little bit more, because Mom hated history, and I have got one, Annie, who's a history major. I know. I don't like the wars. So I would just say, here's World War I, and this is why, here's the World War II, and this is why, and then let's move on to something more fun. Like, I loved the Renaissance. I loved different periods of history, but not so much the strife.
Mm-hmm.
So my daughter, who is now has her master's in education and history, is teaching at a private Christian school, and she loves history. So even if mom doesn't like a subject, and my youngest, please pray for him. He is a first lieutenant, an executive officer under the commander, whatever exactly that means, because he draws these schematics, and I'm like, I save it, but I don't quite understand it. But he gets deployed in a month, so we are praying for him, and he'll be
Yeah.
in South Korea. So it's
Okay.
a little bit of a
Yeah.
hard thing when you're a mom and
Sure.
you have an army boy, but
Mm-hmm.
he you know it's like you can prepare your children, and he loves the Lord, so that's good, and we'll
Mm-hmm.
just keep moving on.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So that is what is happening with you currently. And for this
Yes.
episode, we're going to take a step back
Sure.
into your history. Hopefully you're okay with your history. And
Yes.
and I am very curious as to why you decided to homeschool initially. I don't think we've ever discussed that.
Yeah, interestingly, not for the reasons a lot of people do, not because I researched it. I'd go to conference and I'd have young mommies with, were pregnant, and all from all walks, and they were researching, and I was like so impressed. Oh my gosh, this is like awesome. But I just fell into it because my oldest has a form of Down syndrome, and I even hate telling people that because he's very high functioning. So I would sit. We knew the doctor, and I would see him at social gatherings, and he would just be like, have this look on his face, like, oh no, she's going to corner me. And I would just be like, I don't understand why my son's not doing this, this, and this. He was missing the milestones. And
Mm,
he just said, you're an educator, you're looking for things. Well, no mother looks for things. So finally, because we didn't have the testing back then, we found out that he had a chromosome abnormality, which is trisomy 21, which is different than full Downs.
mm,
So he's very high functioning, like IQ test plus or minus 10. So he's in the range. And I prayed he would talk. He doesn't shut up anymore. So be careful what you pray for. But, went through speech therapy, occupational therapy, and then tried to find a place for him that would
mm.
work. And I have to tell you, I am a very selfish person. I was an only child until my other two brothers were born, 7 and 8 years younger. And I think my mother would have had 100 kids, just didn't happen. And so, I thought that the universe revolved around me, very spoiled, whatever little Felicetta wants. I'm Italian, she gets. And now I've got this child who was a real challenge. And then 2 years later came Christina. So I really focused my attention. I was blessed that I didn't go back to work after we had the children. My husband and I had talked about that. And praise God, we were able to stay home. And so he became my big project, and so I put him in a private Christian school that was, I put both my kids in preschool, if you can believe that, because that was the doctor saying, he's modeling adult, language, and when you think about it, how stupid is that? Because adult language is actually better than little kid language, but you don't know. So if those of you who are out there who have said, how could I not have seen it? How did I? What kind of intervention? If you love your kids, you play with them, you read with them. And I immersed my kids in everything. I was very bored staying at home after being
Mhm.
very active. So we did field trips and, nature museums and all kinds of things. And so he was getting a better education. And then I was having to go into the classroom and help the teacher because guess what my major is?
Mhm.
Elementary education, specific learning disabilities, which takes me K through 12 and early childhood learning. So as if the Lord did not equip me, but I didn't want to listen because I had gotten in with a group of friends that were more interested in playing tennis and doing things that were fun rather than because you put your kid in preschool and what do you do all day? Your house is clean, and so you go have fun
Mhm.
with the wrong group of people. So finally, I just prayed and thankfully had a strong faith. And I just said to the
Mhm.
Lord, what do I do? Well, God brings in this lady, and her husband was a doctor and she was a PhD. And she was homeschooling her severely Down's daughter. And so she said, come on over. Or I had advice from other people who said, no, you need to send him away to a special school. And here they
Mhm.
are in Chicago. And it was just like, I'm not sending my child away.
Mhm.
And I'm going to, so God provided this lady, and she was, oh my gosh, Chris Worthington, God bless you. I don't know if you still live in Fort Myers, but she just set me straight and said, look, God equipped you. Here's what I do with my daughter. And her daughter was amazing, just amazing.
Mhm.
And so I homeschooled Neil and then decided to homeschool Christina and just never looked back. So,
Mhm.
and then it really got into more of, I did it as well because, for religious reasons. That was the
Mhm.
reason I would never put my children back, even though there were some really good schools
Mhm.
locally at some point. And I just said, no, this works for us. And I had kids that were all over the spectrum with not autism, but
Mhm.
with, some struggled in learning, some were auditory process deficient, some were, visual, and some were brilliant. I had the gifted kids. And most kids that struggle are just bright. And I call it like there's just a loose spark plug that needs to be tightened. And,
Mhm.
you can fix dyslexia. It takes a long, hard road, but you can
Mhm.
do it. And so I did it. And I didn't do it using the training I was given, because the training I was giving was accommodating and I wanted to
Hmm.
repair.
Hmm.
So it took a lot
Interesting.
of brain training types of activities, and it worked. I mean, you know, two of my dyslexics went on. One's magna cum laude and one was cum laude. So, Mike, my youngest, was just brilliant.
Mm.
He wanted to learn to read. I didn't have time because I said, "You're only 4. Can you just wait?" And then a couple of months later, he came up to me and he said, "Mom, I already taught myself to read." And I go, "What do you mean?" Sat down, pulled out the book. It's 100 Easy Lessons. I don't know if any of you have
Mhm.
used those. And he, whereas his other brother said, you need to rename this book. It's 100 really, really, really hard lessons.
That's cute.
So one size does not fit most in my
Mhm.
home. So
Mhm. Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
that was really great. I think homeschoolers are going to really enjoy your description of, your journey into homeschooling. So now we're going to pivot a little bit, but still stay in those early days and talk about discipline. I have many parenting authors who want to come on the podcast and talk
Okay.
about their approach to discipline. And my approach, and people who have heard me speak at conferences will know that, and I'm not going to say that my approach was always this way, but for the last few years, my approach has really been to believe that parents know best how to discipline their
Hmm.
kids. And yes, they can get off track a little bit
Right.
to the too soft discipline,
Hmm.
or a little bit to the too hard discipline, but that they can make some adjustments to find what is just right for them as a family. But I saw an email come across for an episode that you did about discipline when you were raising and homeschooling young kids, and I really, really liked it. And so I want to start off by talking about, was discipline a challenge for you initially, like it was
Hmm.
for me? And, I'm a psychologist and it was still a challenge for me. And so, if it was a challenge for you, how was it a challenge?
And it's funny, Melanie, there's short-term memory sometimes isn't so great, but long-term, I remember when I was first interviewing you to come on to the network and I said, "Oh my gosh, you're a psychologist, do child discipline." And you were like, "I don't like child discipline. So I loved it. And then I go, what are you going to talk about? Oh, organization and systems. And I'm just going, okay, all right. I like this lady. And I probably came up to you and said, you need a podcast on my network, probably. I do that a lot to people, Carol Top, I walked up to her and said, would you write a book for me? She goes, no publisher has ever said that to me ever. But it's true, because we know ourselves, and like I would never write a book on parenting, but I actually might now. But if you had asked me that at that time, I would have said no way, because credentials are great. They're wonderful. They give you, like when people say, "Oh, you're a teacher, you have all these like certifications." Yes. But I had to unlearn some of what I learned. And then real life is always different. When I was pregnant, I would look at people who had children and go, okay, they survived. I like to use humor a lot in my life, and I would say to my husband, okay, if I die in childbirth, please ask your sisters to help, because I know my husband, and help set you up or something. And he was just like laughing and going, you'll be fine, and then I had 5 children. But so yes, with Neil especially, because once you get a diagnosis, which we did not get till he was 4 years old, Melanie, 4 years old. And I was in 1 year of mourning. I really was like, the Lord and I had this relationship, I thought, and then it was like, is this how you treat your loyal followers, And I had to realize, and I really felt like the Lord said to me, do you really think that I give any of my special children to people who could not handle it? And so, yeah, I'm going to want to tear up too. No. And so I really felt convicted that I had him for a reason. For number one, it was partially for my salvation, to get me out of self into, and then the second is that we love our kids so much that we don't want to hurt them. And discipline hurts us more than it does them. And if you can just take nothing else from this podcast and just remember that, it's really true, because then 10 minutes later, they're all fine, unless you've got a pouty child. And, if you do, then I would not feed into that, because Jeff and I work with, for the last 4 years, I'm Catholic, and in our church it's called pre-Cana, so before the wedding feast of Cana. So we work with engaged couples, and I want to tell you, I've seen these adults now, and sometimes we don't even work in the book. We listen, and Jeff's really good at like bringing stuff in, whereas I'm more like, we really need to discuss this, and this is your homework, and come back and we'll get together again and discuss. But I mean, we've gotten people that, and I think, what were you like as a child? Because like one person, super non-confrontational, they have a disagreement and she doesn't want to talk about it for like a day or 2 days. It's like, okay, you have a little break, but can you imagine your child saying to you, or being angry? I've had friends who have said, oh, my daughter pouts for like a week. It's like, why are you letting her, and then they're trying to do what? Oh, do you want some candy? Or let me take you to the store. It's like the child's manipulating you. So going back, yes, there was issues, especially with Neil. And then also with wanting to, overcompensate sometimes, with our kids, and just saying, oh my gosh, they're homeschooling and they don't really have any close friends, or 20 birthday parties to go to, or, because we're remembering some of what we went through. And then I can just, say, even though that came with bigger homeschool groups and that sort of thing, I often would go to the birthday party and stay there and then be very thankful that I was, or my kids played sports and Dad or I were always there. We didn't just drop off our kids, or, my husband coached a lot. So as a mom and a dad, it's important to be engaged with your children. And the more you are engaged with them, the better it is. I'm going to segue to my daughter with 9 children. And she disciplines totally different than I ever did. I
Mhm.
started out as the angry, repeating parent. And that what that is you're going to be in big trouble, if you don't do blah, 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 blah. And I'm going to give you, I'm going to count to 5. Well, then you're counting to 10. And then it's still not working. And it was just like, and then it was rinse and repeat. So that's why when my kids went to preschool, which is ironic, I found this 1-minute discipline book that we're going to talk about in a minute. But and it was a lifesaver. It's no longer in print, but I did find a copy because I thought, I want to talk about this. I can't believe I searched my podcast. I'm like, I can't believe I didn't talk about this already because it was a lifesaver. I didn't do it always as it was designed, but I used pieces of it. And then sometimes I just did it as it was designed, depending on the kid. But my Christina, who I call the miracle mom, she would come to the house sometimes, and she talks as much as me, if not more. A little chip off the old block. She's the one who wrote the novels with me, and so she would just talk her kids to death. I just really, can't believe that you didn't do what. And so she naturally does this 1-minute thing, but she also was really like, we're like laughing in the background, but like I remember one time little 4-year-old Emma came and it's like, Mommy, did you bring my sippy cup? And her mother said, No, Emma, do you remember I told you to, get it before we left? And she goes, Mom, that's not thinking of others. And you're thinking, okay, where did that child get that? Because her mother must. So we're just like, and her mother just like looks at her very sternly and said, Emma, what did we discuss? What I say to you in a discipline is not what you say back to Mommy. But yes, you can go ask Grandma if she has a cup you can use. Of course, Grandma had like 35 in different colors, Of course we do. So, and she just loved her one sippy cup. But that's the thing, that her child said, you must not be thinking of others. And how do your children tend, what do we say? Why do they pick up all my bad qualities and not all the good stuff I do? Well, because you're exemplifying those bad qualities more often so that they can pick them up rather than the good. And Christina was really good at like, timeout did not work for me with my kids, but she would come to the house and say, Grandma, we have a nice big pool, and she'd go, Alex can't go swimming right now. He has to spend 4 minutes in timeout. Alex, go to the corner, and he knew not if he complained, well, it's not fair. We're adding another minute, Alex. We've discussed that. But for me, I remember Michael being the one who, we did spank on occasion. I only had to spank him. This is the youngest. Spank him once. And he said, that hurt really, really bad. I'm never doing that again. Can I have a timeout? Like, where did that come from? What is this? Design your own discipline? So I said, okay. So then after timeout, he came and I go, discuss, do you know what you did wrong? Go apologize to your brother, kind of thing. And he goes, I just want you to know I wasn't bored at all. See these? And he showed me his fingers. I had my toys with me. It's just like going.
Oh,
so
no.
It was just like, and this child is an in-charge child, he's the youngest, but I think all the military stuff, he comes and he starts ordering people around, and we just kind of look at him like, okay, he's still in that mode. But, you've got different personalities. You don't get one child or 5 children, and it's just like, oh, I found the thing, and this will work for all of them.
Such a good point. Such a good point. I love that. So I am just so eager to have you explain what the 1-minute discipline method is.
So it's really specific. It's broken down into 3 parts. The first 30 seconds ish. Okay. Don't be getting the watch. And, I do have a big clock against the wall. So I could always, over our television, we have this huge, analog clock, and so I could just stand the kids there and look at the time. But for the first 30 seconds, you're letting your child know and you're expressing your anger in a controlled way. You're not screaming at them. And the biggest, I think the first thing is they have to be looking at you, and kids won't. I do, like, I guess I've podcasted so long that sometimes even when I'm public speaking and I'll close my eyes for a second, I'm thinking and processing and I'm going, sorry, podcaster here, but you want to look at them, eye to eye. And if they're not looking at you, they're probably not listening. That takes some training. But at the beginning, you're not going to stress that. Okay. You're just going to lightly hold their shoulders. If you can't do it lightly, just hands off. Okay. But so you're angry. So 30 seconds, you're saying why you're upset. Then you're going to take a deep breath, which is a transition. Then you're going to spend about 20 seconds saying what you like about this child and just building him up. And then the last 10 seconds is a quiz. Do you know why you're angry? And so I added to that.
So you're asking the child, do you know why I am angry as the parent?
No,
or
why
the child is angry?
No, it's why. Okay. So let me go back.
Okay.
So it's more of basically what did you do wrong? It's kind of a quiz. Like, do you know why I'm angry that you misbehaved? So if that explains it a little better. So like the first 30 seconds is just saying things like, and I used my one grandson, Alex. I sent my daughter the link and I said, have the kids love it when I use their names in there.
Aww.
And so he was always one who is not as, he's got the one-liners. He's really funny. In a family of dark-haired people, he's blonde with blue eyes. He inherited somehow genetic, although his dad was blonde at one point and Christina was young. But it's so funny because it's like, I'm the blonde, so we're going to, I don't know, make our presence known. So I like, for sometimes I'd be like, Lord, and you can do this, people, pray for your children. Like, Lord, help me love my son. I did that sometimes. And Lord, help me love my grandson. And so it was amazing because I'm really close to him now. And God grants you that. And you look for the good and you redirect bad behavior. And so I used Alex in my example, so I'll use him again. But it was just like, Alex, I'm really upset that you are in the situation again. And it's not exactly the script I went with my podcast, so you'll put a link on that and they can go listen to it. But so, Alex, I'm really upset that you are in the situation again. You hit your brother, and in this house, you are not allowed to hit. If you are angry, you come to me, or you solve it a different way. You can tell your brother that you're upset with him, but you cannot hit him. You're older than he is, and when you hit, it hurts a lot worse than when he hits you. And then you don't let the child say anything during this time, and you tell them that they're going to be able to say something, but you're angry and you let your anger be known. Okay. You continue on with whatever else you want to say. Then you take a deep breath and you say something like, you are an amazing person. God has created you in his image, and I love you. I am so blessed that you are in my family, and I am so happy that you are my son. And I know that God wants me to let you know every single time you mess up so I can help you become the best young man that you can be. And, you go on with whatever else you want to say there. And it doesn't, if you're a little bit over, that's fine. And then at the end, you say, do you know why you got in trouble? Do you know why I'm upset? And then a lot of times the kid's like, no, what did I do? Which only brings you back to step one again, But, and I think a lot of it is, if we can't get our anger under control, one of my friends is Italian as well. And she just said, I always used to use that Italian card. We're Italian and we're allowed to be upset. And she said, I realize, no, that doesn't give you the ability to scream and yell at your kids. One other thing, and we say this with our engaged couples, and I drill this in because I always hated character assassination. And we've had to define that for some of our couples. What do you mean by that? You don't call anybody stupid or dumb, or it's what let me just say it's what's going on in social media today.
Mm.
I've gotten
Mm.
into some, not by choice on X, attacks on things, and really learned people. And one gentleman called me all kinds of things. And I said, I prayed about it, and I messaged back, on the platform. And I said, if that is the best you can do, and character assassination is how you're going to address my rebuttal, then you really don't have an argument. And if you cannot address it in some way other than my slandering my character, and you don't know me,
Mhm.
and he apologized, and because he's this learned doctorate person, and so basically that's what we've devolved into, because it shuts people up. Because if somebody's saying
Mhm.
stuff, you're just in shock. And what does that do? It erodes your authority over that child. If you've done that, it's okay to say you're sorry.
Mm.
And I do this whole thing. There's a difference between, and I've developed it more. I have a podcast, A Few Minutes with God podcast. Secret, it's for my kids. So when they left home, I was like, oh no, I'm not going to be able to do little faith things with them. And one of my kids called me on it and said, Mom, are you doing this for us? And I said, yes. I'm on 300 and something episodes now, and it does have a larger audience than 8 people that I think it started with. It's in the hundreds. Sometimes it's in the thousands. And I'm like, who are these people listening? But one of the things I talk about is forgiveness. And that podcast, Melanie, probably will not surprise you, is one of the earlier ones I did. I did a 2-part on forgiveness, and it is the most listened to of any of the
Mhm.
podcasts I've done, because we are so wounded, and
Mhm.
we have to forgive in order to be forgiven. There's a difference between saying, I'm sorry, or saying, will you please forgive me?
Mhm.
Because now it's putting that on the other person, that they can choose to forgive you or not. So
Mhm.
that's what I added to my my 1-minute discipline. Is I had the child who was the perpetrator,
Mhm.
and to go and say, would you forgive me?
Mhm.
And there's a whole nother thing, and this is where my daughter and I disagree. She's much more forgiving of, it was a mistake, or I didn't mean it. I
Mm.
am less forgiving on the I didn't mean it. I was standing next to one of my grandchildren one time, and we were at the house. There was a party. So, of course, we're setting up. And so there's all kids are excited. There's a party, and they're just going to be bad. And so the 5-year-old grabs the 14-year-old's baseball cap off his head and runs upstairs. The 14-year-old runs upstairs, but the little one is, really wiry, and went under the pool table and, ran downstairs again and locked himself in the bathroom. And Alex is pounding on the bathroom. So I just, his mother's busy and she's outside. And I just walk up to Alex and I said to him, Alex, what, Grandma? If Grandma was your mom, what would be happening right now? And he goes, Grandma, you would take off my head. It's like, I don't know that I take off. I go, okay. And he goes, but you know what, Grandma? You would have taken off Michael's head first, because he's the one who took the bat off. So it's like, kids know, because they come spend the
Mhm.
night at Grandma's house. I'll have all the boys, and I'll have, just the girls. Although Olivia, Christina has 3 girls and all the rest boys. Olivia has asked to come with the boys because it's a lot more fun than when she comes with the teenage girls who just want to talk and hang out, and
Mhm.
so they're here. And I set ground rules. If you're going to come to Grandma's, you're not going to fight. When Grandma says it's time for bed, you're going to go to bed and not come out 10 times for water. Are we
Mhm.
good? Yeah, we're
Mhm.
good. And they're
Mhm.
perfect. So it's just, I think kids need those expectations. We would go into really nice little trinket stores, I can think of like the glass blower place. Okay. My husband loves that place. It's a nightmare for little kids. So before, my husband's like, let's go in here. This is when I had the 2 younger ones. I just had 2. And I said, you go ahead. I need to talk to these guys first. And he's like, kid in the candy shop, going in there. He's a builder. So he loves construction, how things are made. That's one of the channels he watches. And he just loves that kind of stuff. So, and the kids are like, can't we go in, Mommy? And I said, yes, you have a choice. You can either put your hands behind your back or in your pockets. You may not take your hands out of your back, your pockets or behind your back. Or if you do, I will take you out. Do you understand that? And well, what if we want to buy something? And I go, oh, did you bring money? Everything's like, $340, this tiny little thing. And they said, no. And I said, well, let's just look for now, And I said, well, so no, you can't buy anything. No, you can't touch anything. And then I would say, but if you really want to touch things, we'll go to another section where there was a petting, so that you're letting them know that it's not always no. And as one of my daughters said, it was always no. Don't tell me it wasn't always, because that's what they remember. So,
right.
Well,
that is so good to give
yeah.
a balance,
Yeah.
where we're asking kids to practice self-control in the glass shop, but then we take them somewhere where they don't have to be so self-controlled.
Right.
So that's excellent.
I think
Okay,
half
so
of it is they don't know what you expect, and we expect them.
Mhm.
We think that they should know. It's just like Jeff tells, or I'm likening kids to my married couples, and hopefully my engaged couples never listen to this podcast. But one of the things that he says to the men is, don't ever assume you know what she's thinking. Ask. He goes, because what occurs to her never even crosses my mind. And that was one of the revelations that he gave one of the first couples we met with. And I said, oh my gosh, Jeff, is that why you ask me so many questions? Because sometimes he would be asking, like, are you sure you want to do that? Or and I was like, yes, let's just get going here. And that's what he was doing without me ever really knowing. Here's 40 years of marriage, because it was like, I guess 40 or 41 at that time. And I'm just learning things about him, that how they process. And the same thing with your little boys when you're a mom, sometimes it's harder to relate. I remember telling my child to begin with, no guns in this house. I was of the, generation of, I don't want to see guns, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not buying guns, and grandma bought guns. So it stayed at grandma's house. I was like, really, like, we're not going to be violent people here. So what did he do? He took his Legos and he built a gun. He's a boy. It's kind of innate. They're protectors. And we want to have this, persona of what so when I saw that, I was just like, okay, so it's just, I still don't like guns, and everyone in my family has one except my husband and I. so it's just, it's whatever. And I think that's the other thing too. Don't you think as parents, and like the older you've gotten, that you look back and you think, gosh, I was so rigid about certain things that I wish I was more relaxed with.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And that actually leads me to the last question I want to ask you on this topic of discipline. What advice do you have, Felice, for moms who are looking for a discipline method that will work for their family? Maybe they're, struggling to figure out what to do.
I think, that's such a good question, because the reason we were able to homeschool as long as we did, by the time I was done from my first, and I did have times when, like, I did not speak at conference. I needed a break from homeschoolers, and it was just like, I don't like you people very much right now because of stuff going on in the homeschool world, let's say. It's kind of leveled out now, praise God, it's gotten over its growing legs. But, I just know that there were times where I just had to pull back and reanalyze and look at things. And I think the first thing you have to do, mom or dad, listening to this, or even grandparent, is you've got to get hold of yourself first.
Mm.
We went to one of the best disciplining courses, and it was like, here's the secret to discipline. And the secret was get yourself under control first. And I'm like, I don't like this guy, you know, but he was
Yeah.
right, because if you're not
Mhm.
under control, you can't get your child. And what does that mean? That
Mhm.
means get right with your relationship with your husband. The first is, if you're a person of faith, is get right with God, because God
Mhm.
will sustain. The second is, if you are at a loss, I would try the 1 minute discipline.
Mhm.
That methodology was devised by a gentleman who did a lot of foster care. And these
Mhm.
kids were very wounded. And
Mhm.
so he used that because it was like, I want to forget what the term was, but let's just say non-discriminatory. He didn't have a huge
Mhm.
history with these kids. They weren't his, but it worked tremendously well. And it built up their character, because that whole second section is you're telling that child, because they think, oh, you hate me,
Mhm.
or you like blah, blah, blah better than, than I have one child who always said, because I was hardest on him. And thank goodness for the younger two. This is my number 3 child. Thank goodness, because they're like, you know, um, those two act everything out. Michael and Annie. They were like, I kept saying, I need to bottle you and put you on TV. They're not social media people, but they were so funny and so good. But like, Anne would immediately go into me, and Michael would mimic Nick, and Anne would say, Nicholas, are you sorry for what you did? No. Whack. Nicholas, are you going to apologize? No. Are you Was it worth it, Nicholas? Absolutely, and I'd do it again. Whack, So then I'd look over at Nicholas, and he's just laughing, because he goes, "Yeah, I guess that's so true." And
Mhm.
actually, he's my one that I can always count on for everything. He has the biggest heart, and but he was so stubborn. And I found out, later, in like listening to him at 14, he said, "Mom," and he was a great lefty baseball pitcher. He's 6'1", 6'2". Colleges were going to want to have him play, and he came up to me. He goes, I know school's not for me. And he's an entrepreneur. That kid has done so well. He's got 2 businesses going, and he works with my husband. But he goes, how can I take over Dad's business? I'm like, you're 14. You're not taking over a construction business yet. Let's start with some basics, and it was hilarious but he's a lot like I am. We're just going to go full tilt. So let me start a podcast network. I have no idea what I'm doing. I know we can do it. I tell the
Mhm.
tech people what to do. They say you can't do it. Well, of course you can, because they did it over here with blogs. Why can't we do it with audios? Oh, that's brilliant. No, it's just logical. So he's a lot like I am, and that's why we went head to head, Melanie, because he's so much like me. Never going to
Mhm.
give in, just going to take
Yeah.
it to the mat. And
Yeah.
so I would try the 1 minute. The other thing that is my secret sauce, if you really want to know, is prayer. When
Mm.
you have teenagers and you sit there and talk to them, and you can almost see it in their, and this is why you continue with the discipline, you can see the change in their eyes. I explain that more on my podcast, that you'll see when they really start sagging the shoulders and saying, okay, I did it, or whatever. Then you launch into the other.
Mhm.
But I remember my one son this is the oldest, Neil, had just gotten a truck. He wanted this truck, and I said, "How are you going to afford it?" "Well, you and mom and dad will buy it for me." "No, mom and dad might loan you the money for it because you can't qualify, but we're not buying it for you." And I said, like, how much are you willing to pay? And, to make him go through all this stuff. And he said, well, there's no way they're going to come down that much. And I said, Neil, I said, pray. And he said, okay. And he prayed. And then he went and talked to the person who was selling this truck. And they were just, it was, who knows why, but like they came down like $7,000 or $8,000 on this truck. And it was used, but it had like maybe 10,000 miles on it. It was the cutest little, nice little white truck. He loved that thing. And I was asking him again to do certain things, like certain things are different people's jobs. I finally said to him, Neil, if you forget that again, there's going to be a punishment, and you're not going to like it. And he kind of scoffed and is like, yeah, okay, mom. And I go, no, I'm serious. I am going to pray to God. I'm asking him to help me. And I also said, I am so angry right now. I can't even give you this discipline. I'm going to have to pray about it. And, I got the rolling of the eyes, and I wanted to say, Melanie, well, that's an abomination to the Lord, and start quoting scripture, but I withheld myself. I'm like going,
right.
And so I ended up praying, and I get this idea of take away his keys. And I'm just like, don't want to tell the Lord that's a dumb idea. And is this really from the Lord? I'm like, praying and discerning. You are not from the Lord Jesus Christ who walked the ground of Nazareth. Like I want to make sure that I really, God didn't speak to me, but I had this thought.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, I'm going to try it. What can it look, And so I told my husband, and he goes, well, that's kind of dumb. I didn't really say God gave me this because I was a little bit embarrassed. And so I said, well, I can try it, right? And he said, yeah. He goes, tell him to put his keys over in the laundry room where everyone else's keys are, but Neil's weren't because he didn't want anyone moving his truck.
Right.
So I said, I did pray. Are you ready? And he said, yes. And I said, I really feel like you need to give me your keys and put them in the laundry room. I mean, I wasn't even confiscating his keys. He was livid. He was so upset. And it was like, bingo. And I said, what are your choices? And he said, obviously I don't have a choice. And I said, obviously you don't, and so he did very begrudgingly and put it in the laundry room. And may not have done it in the back. Like, I think he even pulled the little hook out of the wall. He had to redo at insult. Well, he had to go fix it, And so it's just like stick to the plan kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. My other son, the third in a row, that was very difficult at times. What I got from the Lord for him was take his socks. He hated to go barefoot and we used to laugh because we live in Florida. And he would have little ankle, tan lines, and he played baseball. So, he had these little sock lines. And I said the same thing. I'm so upset right now. I don't know what to do. I'm going to pray to the Lord. And I said, just give me a few minutes. Because the Lord was so merciful in answering. Like, I'd almost immediately get some idea that made no sense to me. And so I asked him for his socks. And he did not like that. And then later on, that was his punishment, his go-to. And even the younger kids were like, if you're not good, mom's taking your socks, All right, that's not allowed because mom will pray. No, please don't, mom. Don't pray.
Oh,
so
boy,
I just think,
love it. Very creative.
With life, it's that, you kind of go with the flow. And I think as moms and dads, if you've messed up, we've all messed up, right? Melanie, we have podcasts. It doesn't mean we're perfect,
Right.
But if one thing resonated, try it. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? And so just do that and see how it goes and, adjust as needed.
Yes. Well, I love that. And I absolutely agree that prayer is the secret sauce when it comes to discipline. Well, Felice, this was so much fun. I just enjoyed it so very much. I would love to have you just remind people how to find your podcast because you have multiple podcasts, and just remind them how to find your podcast network as well.
Okay, wonderful. Well, you'll find Melanie's podcast as well on there. Most of us listen on our apps, don't we? So we're like on, one of our podcast apps but you can find me at Vintage Homeschool Moms. That's the main podcast I podcast on. I have another podcast, A Few Minutes with God. I have a couple of other ones that I am trying to get going. I have one that started for young moms and I just really couldn't keep up with it. And I have one for writers. So there's a few podcasts up, but not a lot. If you have a specific question, and I'm probably going to have a lot of emails, but you can email me at felice@mediaangels.com. I do answer my emails. I really love when we put out a newsletter and I actually get responses from people. It may take me a while to answer your email, so just give me some grace in that way, but I will. I answer all emails personally. And then also we're on social media. I'll send you, Melanie, some links where we have a podcast family and friends page that is a group. I said podcast, a Facebook group.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of stuff going on there. There's a lot of, podcasts from people in our network. And I'm going to throw something out there. I am looking for new podcasters. So if you have ever thought about having a podcast or have one, the ones I'm really looking for, I'm looking for someone who will do something on history. I'm looking for someone, I've got maybe somebody coming back with health and wellness. We have a homeopathy for mommies currently that is knocking it out of the park. People love that podcast. But I'm looking for someone who will do, especially with Make America Healthy Again. I am very much, I go to one store in particular. I don't want to give them a shout out, but I love that store because I'm not the only one looking at labels, but I have done that in my defense since 2020. So actually, I take that back, since 2000. My mother died in 1999 and from heart issues. And it was like, oh, well, everybody in our family, my brother, who's got a nursing background and then some medical background, he's like, oh, no, we're all doomed. And I said, I refuse to be doomed. They ate healthy. They just ate way too much, And so praise God, we're all healthy here currently. But I was always careful about, as one of my sons, my oldest said, the younger kids are never going to know what Doritos tastes like, and it's like some certain things are contraband in our house. But I'm sure they've eaten Doritos out in the public, and no slur on Doritos, which are delicious. But anyway, I'd like somebody who would do that. And I also want a podcast for kids. I do some just for kids episodes. And one of my friends called me because her daughter was so upset with her and swore that she must have called me and said, and was talking about her daughter. And she did not. So she goes, I'm putting my daughter on the line because she thinks that I called you and you did this podcast just for her. And it must have resonated because I talked specifically to the kids, like one of them was on discipline, cut out the middleman, just do what, are you going to have to do it anyway? Yes. Well, then just do it, So just little things. And I listen to my grandkids talk, and I'll do that. I'll put one out and then I'll send my daughter the link, and they just like, you're so funny, Grandma. Well, did you get anything out of it besides you think I'm funny?
Yeah.
So, or pitch me your idea. Yeah.
Yes. So. Oh, I love that. And I have recommended the podcast network to so many people because my experience working with you as our founder and leader has been wonderful. And I just thank God Melanie. For you all the time that you first invited me to participate in your audio homeschool conference. It's just hard to believe that.
I know. Remember the expo?
Point, right?
That was a lot of work. Oh my gosh.
Oh, I bet. And then when you asked me to come up with a podcast idea, what a blessing it has been, not just for me, but for the people who have listened to
my show,
but your show and all the other shows on the network. So thank you very much for everything that you do for the homeschooling community.
Absolutely.
And thank you for sharing with me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Melanie, because you're one of our shining stars. And I so appreciate you're one of the ones I can go to and say, I ask you something and you're just honest with me. And I love that. And I think that's what resonates with your audience is that you're real, and people want to see authenticity. I mean, that's a thing. Who knew? It's like what you see is, what you get pretty much, but praise God. So thank you so much too for having me on today.